So hi, Klaus. The first question is, what sparked your interest in ecological economics? What inspired your choice to delve into this area?
Hi, Yuli. Nice to be here. Nice to see you again. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
It's a great pleasure to be here. So why ecological economics? I got a PhD in ecological economics in the US long time ago in the 1990s. It was the first such program worldwide, and I chose it because I was interested in the discussions of limits to growth, alternatives to the current growth paradigm, and how to develop future scenarios, alternative welfare indicators, and so on and so forth. The main difference between ecological economics and environmental economics is while in mainstream economics, nature is considered an input into the economic systems, in ecological economics, the economy is a subsystem to the environmental and social systems, and that has important implications on how we model these interactions. So my main research focus is to conceptualize and model the interactions between human and environmental systems. In other words, I want to know how decisions and problems, it could be a trade war, a policy, a virus, or just consumption decisions in one part of the world, affect other places around the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Klaus. So it was from your PhD study and started the journey from that time. And as you mentioned, the ecologic system that will be larger than the environmental system, so it includes so many different aspects. And that's why I can see your publications. In the old days, you did a lot of work on the water system and also land use. But now, more recently, you focus more on greenhouse gas emissions and carbon emissions. So, but all of this belongs to the ecological system, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so,
Mm-hmm.
okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I know you go, please.
So yeah, that's interesting. I didn't make that observation that I focused initially on land use and water
Yeah.
resources, and more recently I've moved to carbon emissions. But I think what ties it together is this interest in spatial issues and across space, right? And so I work, for example, on local questions. I did research on local issues like land use conflicts in different parts of Europe, or sea level rise in the US, or permafrost uh, affecting the infrastructure in Alaska and in such regions like that. Towards global questions such as how we impact environmental systems elsewhere in the world through our decisions that we make here in this place.
So maybe can you summarize a little bit about your recent research, some key findings in your recent research in this
Okay,
area?
well, yeah, thanks. And at the moment, we are working quite a bit on household carbon footprints. So we look at the carbon inequality of households within and between countries. So we have a really nice global data set with many different expenditure categories within each country. So we have a data set that covers about 90% of the global population. And so we can show what the contribution is of the richest 1% to the current and how much they use up of the remaining carbon budget. So we look at households. Then we look at we use a similar approach then for different entities, ranging from cities, for example. So we inform cities on how they can achieve their net zero targets, and it's again using carbon accounting for that. We look at companies and try to verify or check at least the statements they make in terms of the carbon footprints they have. They're based oftentimes on self-reporting, and they're quite fanciful, wishful numbers they provide. And so there's no real mechanism to check that. So we're working on using different data sets to quantify and check those self-reported measures. And then we look at policies like carbon taxation and what it means for different population groups, and also crises such as the Ukrainian crisis, the US-China trade war, and what does it mean? And my main interest oftentimes is the distributional effect. So what does it mean for the poorest in poor countries, but also in rich countries? So what are the distributional impacts of policies that we have?
Yeah, that's a quite a large range of interest you're working on. Yeah, from household to city to company, and also some most recent international relationship. You want to capitalize that and do that under the ecological system. So that's it's fantastic. Yeah. So let's come to the second question. I understand that input-out model is the major method you use for many years, and you have also supervised lots of famous researchers in this field. Could you please introduce the method briefly to us? How it works? Yeah.
I will give you a 2-hour lecture. No, IO, I don't think is my main approach. I'm driven by interesting research questions, and I choose the method that is most suited to answer the question. So it's not always input-output analysis, and I think less than half of my publications are based on IO, but never mind. I never counted actually. So what is input-output analysis? It's based on input-output tables that are from national accounts that are produced by most countries around the world. And it allows us to calculate the social, economic, and environmental impacts of production and consumption decisions of, as I mentioned before, of households, cities, regions, countries, and globally. And the beauty for me is that it allows to measure the round by round effects or layers of impacts throughout the global value chain. So we can assess the effects considering the entire global web of production interactions. And that's for me the beauty of the approach.
Yeah, thanks. I think most of the audience here, they have some they might have some know the input-output method a little bit, so it's not very too it could be familiar to us here. So the third question is what more details about the method. The MRIO model is a static model that usually overlooks feedback and side effects. So is that possible to integrate it with dynamic economic models to reduce uncertainty in technology investment and consumption changes across sectors? And what alternative technology development pathways could be explored?
Okay, well, I don't fully agree with the statement that it overlooks feedback and side effects. So the MRIO, so we use multi-regional input-output models. It does incorporate feedback, of course, between sectors and consumers, within and between countries and producers, and between regions, and even has feedback, as we know, on the environment. In other words, it shows how our decisions, as I said earlier, lead to environmental pressures or impact. And it can show how environmental or other constraints impact the economy. So it has this feedback between, to some extent, between the environmental system and the economy, or the other way around, between the economy and the environment. So plenty of feedback interactions, but it doesn't have double coupled natural environmental systems. So that's missing, but that's not unique to input-output analysis. I think that's the problem of many many models, and also integrated assessment models do that in very incomplete ways. So the other question was how to make it dynamic. So of course there's the classic economic dynamic input-output models that go back to Leontief, and that has investments endogenous. And then there's recursive dynamics, similar to also to CGE models, where you can change certain elements of the setup and then rerun the model and report those changes. So for example, Leontief and Duchin used what they call a case study approach, where they project technologies, future technologies. They could be based on expert interviews or technical publications exogenously, and replaced current technologies. And then you rerun the model and see what differences it makes. So, so you run these models in recursive steps, but it's not truly dynamic. And then there are less frequent attempts to make I/O dynamic. And so there are very few applications of combining I/O with agent-based models. So where the agents make technology choices based on, it could be costs, or it could be social pressure, it could be many different decision rules. So that's quite exciting in a way. But there's only conceptual ideas on how to do that. And then finally, and there is again a bit more extensive literature, is to combine input-output tables with system dynamics. And so, for example, we have been working on a new generation integrated assessment models that's based on system dynamics, but it has an I/O, MRIO in fact, so a multi-regional input-output table at its core. And so it allows the combination of very detailed accounts, so the provided by the MRIO, in this case Axiobase, which has fairly reasonable country and sector detail and a wide range of environmental indicators, and it's embodied within a system dynamics framework that allows us to model, for example, as in this project, decarbonization pathways for the US and China, since it's Horizon and China most co-funded project, and see what spillover effects that has, what who are the winners and losers along global value chains, what are co-benefits of decarbonization pathways, and what are the effects of different technologies. So to summarize, there are quite a few approaches to make it dynamic. So it's not quite fair anymore to say I/O is a static model, but of course, for the purposes of for environmental accounts or carbon footprinting, it is oftentimes the static model that's used, but probably entirely appropriate for the purpose that it's used for. And again, it's the question that determines the model we use and the approach we use. So oftentimes static I/O is just perfectly fine for what we try to achieve.
Yeah, thanks, Klaus. Yeah, actually there are some debates for a long time about the statics and the dynamic issues of I/O, and this is always the questions will be asked for when a paper is reviewed. Yeah, but thanks for your opinion and some discussion in insights of how to make it dynamic. Yeah. Then we come to some case problem, some real world problem questions for you. So it's about the EU's policy. So how should the EU adopt policies for stable material supply during the green transitions? And how can collaborations between governments, business, non-government organizations, and the public aid in addressing material demand challenges and promoting the green transitions?
Okay, so it's not only limited to the EU, but you're focusing in your question on the EU. But so the EU, what's happening is replacing or trying to replace one dependency on fossil fuels and, for example, Russian gas, and tries to, and also driven, of course, by decarbonization goals, and replaces that dependency with renewable energy sources, but they also require materials, rare earth minerals, and such as cobalt, lithium, and platinum, for example. And so at the same time, the concentration in terms of suppliers of these new minerals that are needed is much higher than what we have experienced in terms of our old dependencies, Russian gas or Saudi oil, as most of these rare earth minerals are to a large extent processed and often also extracted from just very few countries. So the supply chain is dominated mainly by China and a few other countries. So what we do is, in our quest for decarbonization, is replace one dependency with another one. So I think that's quite interesting aspect to the discussion. So the EU and the US and other countries or regions are now looking into closing the supply chain loops and replace with domestic or at least alternative sourcing. And here our approach, MRAO, is again very useful because it can help identify the vulnerabilities and risk of the current or alternative global value chain, supply chains or value chains, yeah. So in our own research, for example, we looked at the decarbonization goals of the EU, different scenarios of different types of technologies, what sort of materials are needed, but also what sort of jobs are required, who are the winners and losers, what are the skill levels, what are the effects on gender. And so we looked specifically at the European Green Deal and what are the spillover effects to achieve the requirements of the Green Deal, but also the spillover effects. What does it mean in terms of resource requirements from other countries? So if, for example, we have afforestation goals within the EU and set aside land for carbon sequestration, reduce agricultural production within the EU, we need more imports of agricultural products from elsewhere. So the question then becomes, where is that stuff coming from? What's the institutional situation in those countries? Does it lead to to deforestation? What does that then mean? Oftentimes it's say Brazil, Indonesia, depending on the products. What does it mean in terms of land-based carbon emissions? What does it mean in terms of biodiversity? So these are all quite interesting and complex problems. And MRAO can really, and global value chain analysis can really help to identify those vulnerabilities along global value chains, the spillover effects in terms of unintended environmental destruction elsewhere, and also find out about the winners and losers along the global value chain. I think was there anything else to your question? You said something about collaboration.
Yeah, collaboration between the governments, BTs, non-government organizations, multi-actors, collaborations.
Now that's an interesting one. Our economic system is based, of course, on competition and the legal framework that protects knowledge rather than freely sharing information. And we see that also in academia. And here now we start slowly in being more collaborative and sharing, but that partly has to be enforced by funding agencies and journals that we have to submit our data And I think such a mechanism is needed also at the global level that brings people to collaborate more to achieve common goals. But at the moment, it seems we are moving towards a worst case scenario in terms of defragmentation and non-cooperation between the various countries. So at the moment, the situation looks a little bit bleak, but of course it's an interesting year with the super election year, and so let's see how that works out. But so what I think is what's needed is global institutions like the IPCC and so on that tries to find solutions, help bring the various players to the table in the COPs and so on. But as I started out by saying, it's not built into the current economic system and political economy, so it has to be enforced almost in the framework for the economy to work rather than the other way around, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Klaus. Let's come to the next question. Next one is about carbon inequality, so which is your recent research focus. So, what can we do to mitigate the inequality, in your point of
Yeah,
view?
yeah, indeed, that's a topic that captivates me the most the last couple of years, is to look at the differences in terms of the carbon implications of our decisions and how different households contribute differently, and the enormous, as also as a reflection of the enormous inequality that we see within and between countries. And so we and then many other authors since then showed how a small elite consumes a fairly large share of the, or is responsible in a way, taking consumption-based emissions accounting, for a large share of carbon emissions, and also in the future is quickly using up, or I could say, we are part of the global elites here in Europe, using up the remaining carbon budget very quickly. And so we try to quantify the extent of inequality, but also how different policy measures, carbon taxation, for example, is regressive in many cases, how subsidies, so there's still more fossil fuel subsidies than more than compensating the carbon taxation globally. I think it was 1.6 trillion dollars. So there's still enormous amounts of fossil fuel subsidies and investments, of course. And those subsidies tend to be progressive, meaning helping mostly the higher income households. So that's the background. So the question then is, or your question then was,
How to mitigate that?
yeah, how to reduce that. And one,
Yeah.
of course, is what we need to do is to investigate the effects of any policy or measure and ask, what does it do to improve the situation of the poorest, or avoid at least or create the least harm to them? And it sounds obvious in a way, but as I explained initially, many policies are often regressive, meaning that they hurt the poorest the most. So we need to have some sort of check for each policies of the effects it has. And by avoiding those effects on the poorest, I think we automatically then also reduce the carbon inequality. And another option is, of course, redistribution through progressive taxation and other means. And so we look, for example, at policies global carbon taxation policies and recycling. So our argument is that despite very high the cost of living crisis and energy price increases, we should still have a carbon taxation, but use it also. And we run different scenarios and show different ways of recycling the revenues from carbon taxation back through different ways like proxy means testing and so on. And what's the best way to combine carbon taxation or carbon pricing more generally with helping the poorest through poverty alleviation and what it means in terms of carbon budget and so on. So it's a fairly complex question, actually. But again, input-output analysis is quite a suitable tool to investigate that. And so we do that in combination with CGE, so computational general equilibrium models, and MRO, I think, is a nice combination. And then most recently with the combination also with IAMs, so integrated assessment models.
Yeah, thanks. So the last question for today's interview is, what factors should young scholars prioritize when planning academic careers? And do you have any advice on selecting research area and overcoming challenges? How can they maintain resilience and motivation when they met challenges? So what do you think?
Yeah, that's a big question. So I have a couple of items, I think, but not necessarily in that order. So what's needed is just based on supervising quite a few PhD students over time and looking at why they potentially drop out or have dropped out and the kind of struggles they have. So one, of course, is grit or perseverance. So I see many people drop out because of all kinds of issues on the way. And so you just, as a student, and there is a researcher later on, more senior, it's always the same. You just have to stick with it and learn to deal with setbacks, rejection letters, and, be aware that the review process can be a bit random at times, and just not take it personally and just get on with it. Another important aspect is balance. Again, I see many people drop out after a really good start. They write a bunch of papers, but then they get burned out during that process. And I think it's really important to need to have hobbies and fun outside academia, because academia can be often a very unhealthy environment. We know from many surveys around, at least in Europe and the US, there's a high rate of depression amongst PhD students, and also the university tends to be a pyramid scheme. So everybody, of course, wants to become a professor, but it's a very small part that manages to do so. Another point is to maintain interest and curiosity. So how to do that? I think it's important to read widely. What I see with my students, oftentimes they're very focused on just doing their PhD. I'm expert on a very small area, but it's important to read outside the immediate research topic and look across research areas or the discipline, outside the discipline, for connections. The best research, in my mind, often comes from cross-fertilization from other disciplines and from outside one's own field. So I think it's important to be aware of what's happening outside and read outside and waste some time that way. I think that's totally fine. That's how it should be. Then why? You to be aware of why you do it. It's about the research, sharing and collaboration, help answering important questions. and not so much the focus on the number of publications and the impact factor and you know, competition. I think that's what academia has turned into, unfortunately. Of course, having said that, I think it's important to play to some extent the rules of the game. So in contradiction to what I just said, you have to look at the number of publications and impact factors, but be a little bit subversive about it. So you need to know the rules of the games. But because they buy you some degrees of freedom. So if you have your publications, then you can buy yourself the freedom to also do more of the stuff you want to do and so on. So I think these are my main thoughts that come to mind. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for your suggestions to the younger generation and the early career